It all started with a knock. Not the friendly, "Hey, can I borrow some sugar?" kind of knock. No, this was the kind of knock that carries the weight of authority, or at least someone who thinks they have it. 3 sharp, deliberate raps on my front door. I was mid-sip of my coffee, savoring the rare tranquility of a Saturday morning, when the sound jolted me back to reality. My first thought? Jehovah's Witnesses. My second thought? Oh God, what did Ethan do now? Ethan is my 10-year-old son. He's bright, curious, and happens to be autistic. He loves 2 things in this world: remote-controlled cars and making them do donuts in our front yard. The kid's a virtuoso with an RC controller. He could probably make a drone land on Mars if NASA gave him half a chance. But apparently, his latest masterpiece, a shiny new RC car with lights and sound effects, had ruffled some feathers in our pristine suburban neighborhood. I opened the door to find 2 police officers standing there, looking as uncomfortable as I felt. Behind them was Eleanor, the self-appointed queen of our HOA and the bane of my existence. She stood with her arms crossed and a smug grin plastered across her face like she'd just won the neighborhood bake-off. Spoiler alert, she didn't. Her cookies taste like regret. "Good morning," one officer began, his tone professional but tinged with hesitation. "We received a complaint about suspicious activity involving a juvenile operating mechanical equipment." I blinked. Suspicious activity? Mechanical equipment? My brain scrambled to connect the dots before landing squarely on Ethan and his RC car. "You mean my son?" I asked, pointing toward the yard where Ethan was happily making his car do figure eights. "Yes," Eleanor interjected before the officer could respond. "Your son has been driving that thing all over the neighborhood. It's loud, it's disruptive, and frankly, it's a privacy concern." Privacy concern? It's an RC car, not a drone equipped with spy cameras. I turned to Eleanor, trying to keep my voice level. "Eleanor, it's a toy car. It doesn't even have a camera." "It doesn't matter," she snapped. "It's disturbing the peace. And what about property values? Do you know how hard it is to sell a house when there's noise pollution?" "Noise pollution? From an RC car?" I glanced at the officers, hoping for some backup, but they were both staring intently at their shoes like 2 kids caught sneaking cookies before dinner. "Ma'am," one of them finally said, addressing Eleanor instead of me, which was rich considering this was my house. "We'll need to assess the situation." Assess the situation? What were they going to do? Arrest Ethan for vehicular tomfoolery. At this point, Ethan noticed the commotion and wandered over, clutching his beloved RC controller like it was Excalibur. He looked up at the officers with wide eyes, completely oblivious to the absurdity unfolding around him. "This is him," Eleanor announced triumphantly, as if she'd just unmasked a supervillain. The officer crouched down to Ethan's level and said gently, "Hey there, buddy, can you tell me your name?" Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he focused on his car, making it spin in tight circles around the officer's feet. For Ethan, actions speak louder than words, literally, because he's nonverbal. "He's not ignoring you," I explained quickly. "He's autistic." The officer nodded slowly but glanced uncertainly at Eleanor, who rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck that way. "Well," she huffed, "if he can't communicate properly, how are we supposed to know he isn't up to something dangerous?" Dangerous? What did she think he was going to do? Weaponize his RC car and stage a coup? "Eleanor," I said through gritted teeth. "He's 10 years old and playing in his own yard. If that's dangerous, then maybe we should ban lemonade stands while we're at it." "This isn't about lemonade stands," she shot back. "This is about rules. The HOA has regulations against excessive noise and disruptive behavior." "Ah yes, the sacred HOA regulations. A document so revered it might as well be etched on stone tablets and stored in Eleanor's garage next to her collection of garden gnomes." At this point, I decided I'd had enough. I stepped between Ethan and Eleanor like an overprotective mama bear who also happens to be a district attorney, a fact Eleanor seemed blissfully unaware of. "Before we go any further," I said calmly but firmly, "you should know something." The taller officer tilted his head curiously. "What's that?" I nodded toward Ethan before locking eyes with Eleanor. That boy is my son. Then I leaned in slightly for dramatic effect and added with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. And I'm the district attorney. The silence that followed was exquisite. You could practically hear Eleanor choking on her self-righteousness. The officers exchanged nervous glances before one of them stammered out an apology. Well, we didn't realize. No, I interrupted smoothly. You didn't. Eleanor opened her mouth to protest but quickly shut it again when I turned my attention back to her. Let me make something crystal clear, I said, channeling every courtroom closing argument I'd ever delivered. Under the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act, both federal laws, you cannot discriminate against someone because they have a disability. That includes calling the cops on a 10-year-old boy for playing with his toy car. Eleanor sputtered incoherently for a moment before finally managing to say, But, the HOA rules don't trump federal law. I cut in sharply. And if you'd bothered to read those laws, which I highly recommend, you'd know that targeting my son because he's autistic isn't just petty. It's illegal. By now, Eleanor's smug grin had melted into something resembling panic as she realized just how badly she'd miscalculated. The officers quickly wrapped things up after that. No arrests were made, shocking, and as they left, one of them muttered under his breath. Good luck dealing with her. Whether he meant me or Eleanor was unclear. As for Eleanor, she stormed off in a huff but not before muttering something about calling an emergency HOA meeting, which sounded about as threatening as being unfriended on Facebook. Once everyone was gone and peace had been restored, for now, Ethan looked up at me and smiled. A small but triumphant smile that made every second of this ridiculous ordeal worth it. And as we headed back inside for lunch, RC car safely tucked under Ethan's arm, I couldn't help but think, if Eleanor thought this was over, oh honey, she doesn't know who she's messing with. Now, let me tell you a little more about myself and the circus I live in, otherwise known as my neighborhood. You see, I didn't always live in the suburban utopia ruled by Eleanor and her HOA cronies. No, I used to live in the city, where people minded their own business and the only time you heard from your neighbors was when someone borrowed your lawnmower and forgot to return it. But after Ethan was diagnosed with autism, I wanted him to have a quieter, safer environment. So, like every other naive parent with good intentions, I packed up our lives and moved us out to the suburbs. Big yards, good schools, friendly neighbors, or so I thought. What I didn't realize at the time was that moving into an HOA-controlled neighborhood is like voluntarily signing up for a dictatorship where the dictator's weapon of choice is passive-aggressive emails about trash can placement. And Eleanor? She's not just the dictator. She's the supreme overlord. She takes her role as president of the HOA more seriously than most people take their actual jobs. If there were an Olympic event for micromanaging, Eleanor would have more gold medals than Michael Phelps. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not against rules. Rules are important. They keep society functioning. But Eleanor's rules? They're on a whole other level. For example, our HOA has a regulation that states all front lawns must be mowed to a height of exactly 2 inches. Not 1.5 inches. Not 2.25 inches. Exactly 2 inches. And if you think they don't measure, oh, they measure. Eleanor once sent out a warning letter to a neighbor because their grass was visibly uneven. Visibly uneven. Who does that? Then there's the rule about holiday decorations. According to Eleanor's sacred HOA handbook, you're only allowed to put up Christmas lights between December 1st and January 5th. One year, my neighbor Jeff left his lights up until January 6th. One day over the limit, and Eleanor showed up at his door with a clipboard and a fine notice like she was serving an eviction order. And don't even get me started on the trash cans. Trash pickup is every Tuesday morning, which means you're allowed to put your bins out no earlier than Monday evening and must bring them back in by Tuesday night. Sounds reasonable, right? Wrong. Because if your trash can is so much as an inch over the edge of your driveway or left out past 8 p.m. on Tuesday, you'll get a warning letter faster than Amazon Prime can deliver. So yeah, moving here was an adjustment. But let me tell you about Ethan, because he's really the heart of this story. Ethan is my world. He's funny, smart, and has this incredible way of seeing things that most people miss. He doesn't talk much, he's nonverbal, but he communicates in his own way. Like when he's happy, he'll flap his hands or hum this little tune that sounds like something out of a Pixar movie. And when he's excited, oh man, he lights up like Times Square on New Year's Eve. One of Ethan's favorite things in the world is his RC cars. He loves watching them zoom around, hearing the little whirring noises they make, and figuring out how to make them do tricks. This is his happy place. And honestly, watching him play with those cars is one of my happy places too, because for those moments, everything feels right in the world. But apparently, not everyone shares my appreciation for Ethan's joy, namely Eleanor and her band of HOA enforcers. After that ridiculous police visit orchestrated by Eleanor herself, I decided it was time to dig a little deeper into this whole disturbing the peace nonsense she kept harping on about. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I pulled out my copy of the HOA regulations and started reading. Now let me tell you something about HOA regulations. They are ridiculous. This document was 47 pages long and covered everything from acceptable paint colors, only shades of beige or gray, to approved mailbox designs. Apparently anything too modern is strictly forbidden. But nowhere, and I mean nowhere, did it say anything about RC cars or noise levels from children playing in their own yards. What it did say was that residents are expected to maintain a harmonious living environment. Harmonious. That word stuck with me because if anyone was disrupting harmony around here, it wasn't Ethan. It was Eleanor with her constant complaints and nitpicking. But here's where things got interesting. Buried deep in the fine print of this glorified rulebook was a clause about accommodations for residents with disabilities. It stated that any resident with a disability, or their family members, was entitled to reasonable modifications or exceptions to HOA rules under federal law. Federal law. That was music to my ears because if there's one thing I know as a district attorney, it's how to use federal law like a battering ram against petty tyrants who think they're above it. Armed with this newfound knowledge and fueled by equal parts righteous indignation and caffeine, I decided it was time to take action. First things first, I sent an email to Eleanor politely reminding her about the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act, the same laws she'd conveniently ignored when she called the cops on Ethan. I even attached links to official government websites because nothing says, "I'm serious" like hyperlinks to federal agencies. Next, I reached out to some other neighbors who'd had run-ins with Eleanor over similarly absurd issues, like Jeff with his Christmas lights or Karen down the street who got fined for having unauthorized garden gnomes in her flower bed. Yes, that actually happened. Turns out there were quite a few people who weren't exactly fans of Eleanor's reign of terror. And finally, I started documenting everything. Every email from Eleanor, every warning letter she sent out, every time she so much as looked at Ethan sideways while he played in our yard. Because here's the thing about people like Eleanor. They thrive on intimidation and control, but they crumble under scrutiny. By now, you're probably wondering why I didn't just pack up and move somewhere else where HOAs don't exist, if such magical places even exist. And trust me, I've thought about it more times than I can count. But then I look at Ethan playing happily in our yard despite everything, and I realize that running away isn't an option. Because this isn't just about RC cars or noise complaints or even Eleanor herself. It's about standing up for what's right. For Ethan and for every other kid who deserves to grow up in a world where their joy isn't treated like an inconvenience. So yeah, buckle up folks because this story is just getting started. And let me tell you, it only gets better from here. Alright, so here's how things escalated. After my polite but pointed email reminding Eleanor that federal law trumps her HOA rulebook, I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd back down. Take a moment to reflect on her life choices, maybe even Google what reasonable accommodation means under the Fair Housing Act. But nope, Eleanor doubled down like she was playing blackjack and had just been dealt two aces. A few days later, I received an official letter from the HOA. It was printed on fancy letterhead, complete with a gold emblem that screamed, "We take ourselves way too seriously." The letter informed me that Ethan's RC car antics were now classified as a recurring disturbance, and that we were required to attend a behavioral review hearing before the HOA board. A behavioral review hearing for a 10-year-old autistic kid. Let that sink in. Now, I don't know if you've ever been summoned to an HOA hearing, but let me tell you, it's not as glamorous as it sounds. There's no courtroom drama, no gavel banging, no objection moments. It's basically a bunch of people sitting around a folding table in someone's garage, pretending they're Congress. Naturally, I RSVP'd with a firm yes, because there was no way I was missing this circus. And when the day of the hearing arrived, I came prepared. I brought Ethan with me, not because he needed to be there, but because I wanted them to see the person they were targeting. I also brought my trusty binder filled with legal documents, HOA bylaws, and printed copies of emails from Eleanor that could rival any villain monologue. The hearing started promptly at 6 p.m. in Eleanor's garage, which she had transformed into what can only be described as the world's saddest courtroom. There was a folding table covered in a plastic tablecloth, probably leftover from her last garden party, and behind it sat the HOA board. Eleanor, her sidekick Harold, who nodded at everything she said like a bobblehead, and 3 other members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Eleanor kicked things off with her usual flair for dramatics. She cleared her throat loudly, like she was about to deliver the Gettysburg Address, and said, "We are here today to address the ongoing disturbances caused by Mr. Ethan Thompson." I raised my hand like I was back in school. "Quick correction. It's Master Ethan Thompson," I said cheerfully. "He's 10 years old." Eleanor ignored me and continued reading from what appeared to be a script she'd written herself. The HOA has received numerous complaints regarding excessive noise and disruptive behavior stemming from Mr. Thompson's activities. Activities? I interrupted again. "You mean playing with his toy car? In his own yard?" "Yes," Eleanor snapped, clearly annoyed that I wasn't taking her seriously. "But it's not just about the car. It's about the impact on our community." At this point, Harold chimed in with his signature head nod and added, "It's about harmony." Harmony. There it was again, the magical word Eleanor loved to throw around like it was some kind of legal trump card. "Interesting," I said, leaning forward in my chair. "Because if we're talking about harmony, I'd argue that calling the cops on a 10-year-old autistic kid is about as unharmonious as it gets." That got a few awkward coughs from the other board members, but Eleanor wasn't fazed. She launched into a monologue about how Ethan's RC car had disrupted her afternoon yoga sessions and scared her cat, Mr. Whiskers. "Mr. Whiskers has been very distressed," she said solemnly. "Distressed?" I repeated incredulously. "Eleanor, it's an RC car, not a firework display." She ignored me again and turned to Harold for backup. "Harold," she prompted, "tell them about your experience." Harold cleared his throat and said gravely, "Well, last week, I heard the car, and it startled me." "Startled you?" I asked, struggling not to laugh. "Harold, are you telling me you were startled by a toy car?" "It was very loud," he muttered defensively. At this point, one of the other board members, a woman named Linda, spoke up for the first time. She looked at Ethan, who was quietly sitting next to me playing with his RC controller, without the car attached, and said gently, "He seems like a sweet kid." "Thank you," I replied warmly. "He is." Linda hesitated for a moment before adding, "I don't really see what the big deal is." Eleanor shot her a death glare that could have melted steel. "The big deal," Eleanor hissed through gritted teeth, "is that rules are rules, and if we don't enforce them consistently, chaos will ensue." Chaos. Oh yes, because nothing says chaos like a 10-year-old enjoying himself in his own yard. That was my cue to pull out my binder, the piece de resistance of this entire charade. "Well," I began casually as I flipped through pages of legal documents. "Since we're talking about rules and consistency, I'd like to point out something interesting." I held up a copy of the Fair Housing Act for dramatic effect and read aloud. "Under federal law, homeowners associations are required to make reasonable accommodations for residents with disabilities." Eleanor stiffened but didn't say anything. "And here's another fun fact," I continued cheerfully. "Targeting or penalizing someone because of their disability or their family member's disability is considered discrimination." Linda nodded approvingly while Harold shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "And if anyone needs further clarification," I added with a smile directed at Eleanor, "I'd be happy to explain it in court." That did it. Eleanor's smug facade cracked just enough for me to see panic flicker across her face. The rest of the hearing went downhill for Eleanor after that. Linda openly sided with me, pointing out how ridiculous it was to call Ethan's RC car a disturbance, and one of the other board members actually apologized for how things had been handled. By the end of the night, Eleanor looked like she wanted to crawl under her plastic tablecloth and disappear forever. As we left the garage-turned-courtroom-turned-disaster zone, Ethan tugged on my sleeve and smiled, a big toothy grin that made every second of this ridiculous ordeal worth it. And as we walked back home under the glow of streetlights, and Mr. Whiskers glared at us from Eleanor's window, I couldn't help but think, this is what justice looks like. Now, you'd think that after the HOA hearing debacle, Eleanor would have waved the white flag and retreated into her beige palace of rules and regulations. But no, Eleanor doesn't retreat. She reloads. And this time, she came back swinging with what she must have thought was her piece de resistance. A formal notice that Ethan's RC car was now classified as a nuisance under the HOA bylaws. A nuisance. Let me just say, I've met a lot of nuisances in my life. Telemarketers, mosquitoes, people who chew loudly, but my 10-year-old son playing in his own yard? Not one of them. The letter went on to say that if the nuisance wasn't addressed immediately, I'd face a $500 fine and potential legal action. Legal action. From an HO. It was like being threatened by a mall cop. Annoying but not exactly terrifying. So there I was, holding this ridiculous letter in one hand and my coffee in the other, trying to decide whether to laugh or scream. Ultimately, I chose option 3, revenge. Now, when I say revenge, I don't mean anything illegal or unethical. No slashing tires or egging houses here. I'm a district attorney, after all. I have a reputation to uphold. But what I did have was time, resources, and an intimate knowledge of how to navigate the legal system. And if Eleanor wanted to play hardball, well, let's just say I was more than ready to step up to the plate. Step 1, research. I spent an entire weekend combing through every single page of the HOA bylaws. And let me tell you, it was like reading a dystopian novel written by someone with a grudge against fun. There were rules about everything. How many plants you could have in your front yard, no more than 5. What kind of curtains you could hang in your windows, neutral colors only. Even how long you could leave your garage door open, no more than 15 minutes at a time. But here's the kicker. Nowhere in those 47 pages did it say anything about RC cars being a nuisance. Step 2, allies. Remember Linda from the hearing? The board member who actually had common sense? Well, she turned out to be an invaluable ally. Not only did she agree that Eleanor was out of line, but she also shared some juicy insider info about how the HOA operated, like how Eleanor had been using HOA funds to buy herself office supplies, which apparently included a $300 ergonomic chair and a fancy espresso machine for her home office. Step 3, documentation. I started keeping meticulous records of every interaction with Eleanor and the HOA. Every letter, every email, every passive-aggressive note left on my doorstep. It all went into my growing file of evidence. And just for good measure, I installed security cameras around my property because if Eleanor so much as sneezed in my direction, I wanted it on tape. Step 4, federal law. This is where things got fun. You see, as much as HOAs like to think they're all-powerful entities, they're still bound by federal laws like the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. And targeting someone because their child has autism? Yeah, that's called discrimination, and it's illegal. Armed with all this information, I decided it was time to take things up a notch. So I filed a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, outlining how Eleanor and the HOA had violated federal law by harassing my family over Ethan's disability. And let me tell you, nothing gets an HOA's attention quite like an official investigation from HUD. The fallout was immediate and glorious. First, HUD sent a letter to the HOA notifying them of the investigation and requesting documentation related to their treatment of my family. Suddenly, Eleanor wasn't so smug anymore. In fact, she looked downright panicked when she showed up at my door one morning with Harold in tow. "Mr. Thompson," she began stiffly, clutching her clipboard like it was a lifeline. "We'd like to resolve this matter amicably." Amicably? After months of harassment and threats? The audacity was almost impressive. Amicably, I repeated with mock surprise. Eleanor, you called the cops on my 10-year-old son for playing with his toy car. Harold cleared his throat awkwardly and muttered something about miscommunication. But I wasn't buying it. I'll tell you what, I said coolly. You drop all fines and complaints against my family, and issue a written apology, and maybe we can talk about resolving this amicably. Eleanor bristled but didn't argue because she knew she didn't have a leg to stand on. A few days later, I received an email from the HOA officially dropping all charges against Ethan's RC car and promising to revise their bylaws to include accommodations for residents with disabilities. They even attached a scanned copy of their apology letter, which was clearly written under duress but still satisfying to read. But here's where things got really interesting. Remember those questionable expenses Linda told me about? Well, during HUD's investigation, they uncovered some, let's call them irregularities, in how Eleanor had been managing HOA funds. Turns out that $300 ergonomic chair wasn't exactly approved by the board, and neither was the espresso machine or several other purchases totaling thousands of dollars. Long story short, Eleanor was forced to resign as president of the HOA amid allegations of financial misconduct. Harold tried to step up as interim president but quickly realized he had no idea what he was doing and resigned too. As for me, well, life has been pretty peaceful since then. Ethan still plays with his RC cars in our yard, without any interference from nosy neighbors or overzealous HOAs. And I finally feel like we can breathe again. And Eleanor? Last I heard, she put her house on the market and moved out of the neighborhood altogether. Probably off to terrorize some other unsuspecting community with her clipboard and her rules. So yeah, justice served with a side of poetic irony. So Eleanor was gone. The clipboard queen had abdicated her throne, and for the first time in what felt like forever, our neighborhood had a chance to breathe. No more passive-aggressive letters about lawn height. No more surprise inspections of trash can placement. No more HOA meetings that felt like interrogations. It was like the Wicked Witch of the West had melted, and all the munchkins were finally free to sing and dance. But here's the thing about people like Eleanor, they don't go quietly. Oh no, even after she resigned, she couldn't resist one last act of petty vengeance. A few days after her resignation, I noticed a for sale sign in her yard, which wasn't surprising. She'd been thoroughly humiliated and probably wanted to escape the neighborhood she'd terrorized for years. What was surprising was the price she listed her house for. An absolutely ludicrous amount that made me wonder if she thought Beyoncé was going to move in next door. Now, I'm no real estate expert, but even I knew that her house wasn't worth half of what she was asking. It was a perfectly fine house, neutral beige siding, cookie-cutter design, but it wasn't exactly a mansion. And considering her reputation in the neighborhood, I doubted anyone would be rushing to buy it. Sure enough, weeks went by, and the house sat there unsold. The for sale sign became a permanent fixture on her lawn, like a sad little monument to her failed reign. Meanwhile, Ethan was thriving. He'd upgraded his RC car collection and had started experimenting with ramps and jumps in our yard. Watching him play without fear of Eleanor's interference was like watching a bird finally learn how to fly. But then came Eleanor's next move. A move so petty it almost made me admire her commitment to being awful. One morning, I woke up to find a handwritten note taped to my mailbox. It wasn't signed, but let's be real. There was only one person in this neighborhood who would leave a note written in cursive on monogram stationery. The note read, "Dear Mr. Thompson, I hope you're pleased with yourself. Your actions have not only disrupted this community, but have also negatively impacted property values, including mine. I hope you can live with the consequences." I laughed out loud when I read it because, honestly, the irony was delicious. Eleanor had spent years obsessing over property values, sending out warnings about uneven grass and unauthorized garden gnomes, all while alienating every single person in the neighborhood. And now, her own property value was tanking because no one wanted to live in a house associated with her. It was poetic justice at its finest. But here's where things got interesting. Linda, the sensible board member who'd sided with me during the HOA hearing, decided it was time for some real change in the neighborhood. She rallied a group of residents and proposed completely overhauling the HOA bylaws to make them less restrictive and more inclusive. Her argument: the HOA should focus on fostering community rather than enforcing arbitrary rules about mailbox designs. The proposal passed unanimously because, let's face it, everyone was tired of living under Eleanor's dictatorship. The new bylaws included provisions for accommodating residents with disabilities, relaxed rules about lawn care and holiday decorations, and, my personal favorite, a ban on using HOA funds for personal purchases like espresso machines. With the new bylaws in place, the neighborhood started to transform. People began putting up colorful flower beds without fear of fines. Kids played outside without worrying about noise complaints. Someone even threw an impromptu block party, a concept that would have sent Eleanor into cardiac arrest. As for me, well, I decided to celebrate by hosting a little gathering in my yard. A freedom from Eleanor party, if you will. I invited all the neighbors, except Eleanor, obviously, and set up a mini RC car racetrack for Ethan and his friends to enjoy. We had burgers on the grill, music playing, and laughter filling the air. A stark contrast to the tense atmosphere that had defined our neighborhood under Eleanor's rule. And you know what? Felt good, really good, to see everyone coming together like that. For so long, we'd been living under this cloud of fear and resentment, tiptoeing around Eleanor's rules and trying not to get on her bad side. But now we were free. Of course, Eleanor didn't attend the party. Not that she was invited, but she did make one last appearance before moving away for good. On the day, she finally packed up her beige palace and drove off into the sunset, or more likely into another HOA-controlled suburb where she could start fresh. She made sure to leave behind one final passive-aggressive gesture. A pile of old HOA newsletters dumped on my doorstep. I stared at the pile for a moment before bursting out laughing because honestly, it was just so Eleanor. Even in defeat, she couldn't resist trying to make some kind of statement, though what that statement was supposed to be remains unclear. In any case, life went on without her, and it went on beautifully. Ethan continued thriving in our yard-turned RC car playground. Linda became president of the HOA, and a much better one at that. And our neighborhood transformed into something resembling an actual community rather than a bureaucratic nightmare. As for me, well, let's just say I learned a valuable lesson through all of this. Never underestimate how far some people will go to enforce arbitrary rules, and never underestimate how satisfying it is to stand up to them. So yeah, justice wasn't just served, it was served with sprinkles on top. Eleanor was gone, the neighborhood was finally free, and life was good. But let me tell you, the aftermath of her reign left us with stories that will be told at neighborhood barbecues for years to come. Honestly, if someone ever starts a Netflix series about HOAs, we've got enough material here for at least 3 seasons and a Christmas special. Now, I'd love to say that everything went back to normal after Eleanor left, but let's be real. What even is normal in an HOA neighborhood? Sure, the atmosphere was lighter, people were friendlier, and no one was measuring their grass with a ruler anymore. But there were still some lingering signs of Eleanor's legacy. For example, the for sale sign in her yard stayed up for months because apparently no one wanted to buy a house with that kind of bad juju attached to it. I mean, would you want to live in the former lair of the HOA overlord? Didn't think so. Eventually, though, someone did buy it. A nice couple named Sarah and Mike who moved in with their 2 golden retrievers and immediately became everyone's favorite new neighbors. They threw a housewarming party within a week of moving in and invited the whole block. There were drinks, snacks, and not a single clipboard in sight. It was glorious. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to thrive. With Eleanor gone and the new HOA bylaws in place, he had free rein to play with his RC cars without anyone breathing down his neck. He even started teaching some of the other kids in the neighborhood how to build ramps and customize their cars. Watching him laugh and play with his friends made me realize just how much we'd been holding our breath all those months under Eleanor's rule. And speaking of the new bylaws, can we just take a moment to appreciate how much better life is when rules are made by reasonable people? Linda and the new HOA board did an amazing job turning things around. They focused on things that actually mattered, like organizing community events and making sure everyone felt welcome, instead of obsessing over mailbox designs and holiday decorations. It was like night and day. One of my favorite changes they made was introducing a community fun day every month. The first one was held in the park down the street and featured food trucks, live music, and a bouncy house for the kids. Ethan brought his RC cars and set up an impromptu racetrack that quickly became the highlight of the event. Even Linda gave it a try, and let me tell you, watching a 60-something-year-old woman giggle like a kid while driving an RC car is something I'll never forget. But here's where things get really good. Remember those security cameras I installed during my feud with Eleanor? Well, they ended up capturing something very interesting one night. A raccoon rummaging through my trash cans. Now, normally this wouldn't be noteworthy except for one small detail. This raccoon had somehow managed to knock over my trash can and drag it halfway across my yard before disappearing into the bushes. Why is this relevant? Because I decided to name him Mr. Whiskers, after Eleanor's cat. And he quickly became something of a neighborhood mascot. People started leaving snacks out for him, probably not great for his health, but hey. And someone even made a little cardboard sign that said, Mr. Whiskers' Den, and stuck it near his favorite bush. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Eleanor had spent years terrorizing us over minor infractions like trash can placement, and now her namesake raccoon was running amok without a care in the world. Felt like poetic justice. But let's get back to the real victory here. Community. For so long, our neighborhood had been divided. People were afraid to speak up or stand out because they didn't want to end up on Eleanor's bad side. But once she was gone, something amazing happened. We started coming together. People who'd barely spoken before were now chatting over fences and organizing potlucks. Kids who used to stay cooped up inside were playing together in yards and driveways. Even Jeff, the guy who got fined for leaving his Christmas lights up an extra day, started decorating again without fear of retribution. And me? Well, I learned something important through all this. Sometimes standing up for what's right means ruffling a few feathers, or in this case, clipboard-wielding tyrants. It wasn't easy going head-to-head with Eleanor and her HOA army, but it was worth it, because at the end of the day, it wasn't just about Ethan or his RC cars. It was about creating a neighborhood where everyone felt safe and welcome. So yeah, justice was served, and it tasted even better than those burgers we grilled at our Freedom from Eleanor party. Now, before I wrap this up, let me leave you with one final thought. If you're ever dealing with an HOA or any kind of petty bureaucracy, remember that knowledge is power. Know your rights. Know the laws that protect you. And don't be afraid to stand your ground when someone tries to push you around. And hey, if all else fails, get yourself a binder full of legal documents and channel your inner district attorney. Trust me, it works wonders. Alright folks, that's my story. If you enjoyed it, or if you've ever had your own run-in with an HOA dictator, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you found it entertaining or cathartic. Share it with anyone who needs a good laugh at Eleanor's expense, and subscribe to my channel for more stories like this one. Thanks for listening, and remember, never underestimate the power of an RC car or a determined parent. See you next time.